The wind howled like a hungry wolf outside the small cabin. Rain hammered against the windows, each drop a tiny fist trying to break in. James BlackWood sat alone, huddled by the weak fire. He was only 17, but he felt much older. His parents were gone. The mountain was his only neighbor now, and tonight, it felt angry. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, twisting into strange shapes. They looked like long, grasping fingers. James pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. He tried not to look at the windows, where the darkness pressed in, deep and absolute. Outside, lightning split the sky. For a brief second, the entire mountain was lit up, stark and menacing. The trees, stripped bare by the coming winter, looked like skeletons reaching for the clouds. James had lived here his whole life, but he had never felt so afraid. The mountain had always been a friend, a playground. Now, it felt like a monster watching him. Every creak of the old cabin's timbers made him jump. Was it just the storm? Or was something else out there, waiting in the wind and the rain? He could almost hear a voice in the gale, a whisper he could not quite understand. He missed his parents more than anything. He missed his father's steady presence and his mother's warm smile. They had loved this mountain. They had taught him its secrets, the names of the birds, the paths through the deep woods. But they had never told him to be afraid of it. Why did it feel so different now? Why did the familiar woods suddenly seem so hostile? It was as if their passing had awakened something ancient and unkind, a presence that had been sleeping beneath the rock and soil. The fire crackled, spitting a spark onto the hearth, and James flinched as if it were a gunshot. He knew he could not stay huddled here forever. Fear was a cold, heavy thing, and it was settling deep in his bones. The storm was not just outside, it was inside him too, a storm of grief and a growing dread. The mountain was calling to him, not with the gentle invitation of his childhood, but with a dark challenge. He felt a strange pull, a sense of unfinished business that hung in the air, as thick as the smoke from the dying fire. Something was wrong on this mountain, something connected to his family, to the reason he was now all alone. He had to find out what it was. Driven by a restlessness he could not name, James began to search the small cabin. He felt like a ghost in his own home, touching things that still held the memory of his parents. He ran his hand over the worn armchair where his father used to sit. Beneath the chair, his fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. Curiosity pushed aside his fear for a moment. He pried it open with his fingernails. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. It was his father's journal. His father, Andrew, had never mentioned it. A sudden chill, colder than the draft from the window, ran down James's spine. He settled back by the fire, the heavy leather-bound book in his lap. The first few pages were filled with his father's familiar handwriting. He wrote about the changing seasons, the beauty of the mountain, and his love for his family. But then, the tone changed. The writing became rushed, darker. He wrote about the BlackWood bloodline and a duty that was passed down through generations. He mentioned a curse, a fight for control of the mountain's power. James's heart began to beat faster. This was not the simple, quiet man he knew. This was a man hiding a terrible secret from his own son. The journal spoke of a deep disagreement, a brother against a brother. His father, Andrew, and his uncle, Torin. James barely remembered Torin. He was a dark figure from his early childhood, a man his parents never spoke of. According to the journal, Torin wanted to use the mountain's inherent energy for his own selfish gain. He craved power and control. Andrew believed their family were not masters of the mountain, but its protectors. They were guardians, meant to keep the balance and protect the ancient life force that resided within the stone and soil. The fight had torn them apart. The last entry was terrifying. His father wrote of Torin's obsession with dark magic. He had been twisting the mountain's energy, corrupting it. Andrew feared that Torin had become something more than human, something monstrous. "He will not stop," his father had written. "The curse he has embraced will consume him, and then it will consume the mountain. I fear for my son. I fear for what he will have to face." The journal ended there. The storm outside seemed to quieten, as if holding its breath. James now understood. The fear he felt was not just grief, it was a warning. His uncle was still out there. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving the world washed clean and unsettlingly quiet. James knew what he had to do. He packed a small bag with food, water, and his father's journal. The path up the mountain was slick with mud and fallen leaves. The air was cold and sharp in his lungs. Every snap of a twig under his boots sounded like a cannon shot in the silence. The woods felt different today. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like crooked arms, their leaves whispering secrets he could not decipher. He was no longer just a boy walking in the woods. He was walking into a story he was never meant to know. As he climbed higher, a strange fog began to roll down the slopes. It was thick and gray, clinging to the ground and swallowing the path ahead. Within moments, he was surrounded. He could barely see the trees in front of him. Ghostly shapes drifted in the mist, things that looked almost human before dissolving back into vapor. He heard voices, faint and sorrowful whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. They were the echoes of the past, spirits disturbed by his uncle's dark influence. James clutched the journal to his chest, its familiar weight a small comfort against the growing terror. He saw signs of his uncle's magic everywhere. Trees were blackened and twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark scorched as if by an internal fire. The ground in some places was barren and gray, where no grass or moss would grow. A stream that should have been clear and bubbling was sluggish and black, its water thick like oil. This was the corruption his father had written about. Torin was not just taking power from the mountain, he was poisoning it. He was killing it from the inside out. The spooky feeling was now a certainty. A deep evil had taken root here. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach. He wanted to turn back, to run to the safety of the cabin and pretend he had never found the journal. But then he would think of his parents. He would think of his father's last, desperate words. They had died protecting this mountain. They had died protecting him. He could not let their sacrifice be for nothing. This was his legacy, his responsibility. He took a deep breath, the foggy air chilling him to the core, and took another step upwards. He was scared, but he was no longer just a scared boy. He was a son with a purpose. The path ended abruptly at the entrance to a dark cave, a gaping wound in the side of the mountain. A foul, cold air drifted out from its depths, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. This was the heart of the corruption. James could feel it, a thrumming, malevolent energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. This was where he would find his uncle. Taking one last look at the sky, he stepped out of the fog and into the oppressive darkness of the cave. His footsteps echoed eerily, swallowed by the immense, silent space within the mountain. Inside, the cave opened into a vast cavern. Strange, glowing moss cast a sickly green light on the scene, revealing the true horror of his uncle's work. Dark symbols were carved into the stone walls, pulsing with a faint, dark energy. In the center of the cavern stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, but it was not entirely human. One side of its body was twisted and monstrous, the skin like cracked stone and one arm ending in sharp, black talons. The other side was still recognizable as a man. It was his uncle Torin. He turned, and his eyes glowed with the same green light as the moss. James. Torin's voice was a rasp, a dry rustle of dead leaves. The son of the weak brother. "I knew you would come. The mountain called to you, did it not? It calls to all of us with BlackWood blood." He took a step forward, his transformed leg dragging heavily on the stone floor. He was a perversion of nature, a man who had tried to steal power and had been warped by it in the process. He was no longer just a man. He was a living embodiment of the curse his father had feared, a monster made of greed and dark magic. "My father tried to stop you," James said, his voice shaking but firm. He would not let his fear show. He would not give his uncle that satisfaction. Torin laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the cavern walls. "Your father was a fool. He saw this power and wanted to hide it, to let it sleep. He wanted to be a gardener when he could have been a king. This mountain belongs to us, boy. It is our birthright to command it, not to serve it like a slave." The glowing symbols on the wall pulsed brighter, and the air grew thick and heavy with power. As Torin spoke, his words filled with rage and arrogance, James clutched his father's journal. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages his father had written. He was not looking for a spell or a weapon. He was looking for understanding. And then he found it, in a passage he had overlooked in his fear. His father explained the true nature of their family's legacy. The BlackWoods were not meant to be masters. They were not meant to be kings. The power of the mountain was not something to be taken or controlled. It was a life force to be protected. The first BlackWood had not conquered the mountain. He had healed it after a great sickness had scarred the land. He had bonded with it, promising that his family would act as its guardians for all time. They were stewards, meant to ensure its health and balance. The power was the mountain's own life, its spirit. Torin's lust for control was a betrayal of that sacred vow. He was not claiming a birthright. He was violating a trust that was centuries old. The whispers James had heard on the path were not just random spirits. They were the mountain itself, crying out in pain. "You're wrong," James said, his voice growing stronger. He looked up from the journal and met his uncle's glowing eyes. "This power isn't ours to take. It was never meant for us to control. We're supposed to be its protectors. You aren't honoring our family. You are destroying everything we were ever meant to be." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Torin's monstrous face. He had been so consumed by his desire for power that he had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, the origin of his own family's connection to this place. Understanding flooded through James, washing away the last of his terror and replacing it with resolve. He was not here to fight his uncle with magic or with force. He was here to remind the mountain of its true guardians. He was here to honor the promise his ancestors had made. The final battle would not be won with power, but with truth. He represented balance and protection. Torin represented greed and corruption. James closed the journal. He was no longer just Andrew's son, scared and alone. He was a BlackWood, and he understood what that name truly meant. Torin howled with fury, his doubt replaced by rage. He would not be lectured by a boy. He raised his corrupted, taloned hand, and dark energy swirled around him, pulling at the very stones of the cavern. The glowing symbols on the walls flared violently, but James did not raise a weapon. He stood his ground, closed his eyes, and focused. He did not try to take power from the mountain. Instead, he offered it something. He offered his sorrow for what had been done, his respect for its ancient life, and his promise to uphold the original vow of protection. He offered himself as a guardian, just as his father had been. A different light began to fill the cavern. It was not the sickly green of Torin's magic, but a warm, golden glow. It seeped from the stone floor and walls, pure and clean. The mountain was responding. It recognized the true heir to its legacy, not the one who screamed for control, but the one who offered service. The dark symbols carved by Torin began to fade, sizzle, and crack under the gentle, persistent light. Torin screamed as the pure energy washed over him. It was not attacking him. It was simply cleansing the space he had defiled. His dark magic had no foundation here anymore. The stolen power that made up Torin's monstrous form was unraveled by the mountain's pure light. It had been a parasite, and its host was now being healed. With a final, agonized cry that was more sorrowful than angry, Torin crumbled. His body dissolved into black dust and shadows, which were then swept away by the golden light, leaving nothing behind. The cavern was filled with a peaceful, warm glow. The oppressive cold was gone. The foul smell was replaced by the clean scent of wet stone and earth. The battle was over. The curse was broken. James walked out of the cave and into the morning sun. The fog had lifted. The sky was a brilliant, clear blue. The trees no longer seemed menacing. They stood tall and proud. He could hear the birds singing, and the stream he had passed earlier now ran clear and fast, its cheerful bubbling a welcome sound. He had faced his fear, his past, and the monster his uncle had become. He had not won with strength, but with understanding and respect. He was alone, but not lonely. The mountain was with him. He was its guardian, and a new day was dawning, full of hope and peace.